we saw a record Q1 in terms of retirement value. We see nature-based forward agreements triple from 22 to 24. And in 24, the value of carbon removal forward agreements was already almost at 60% of the overall retirement value. So clearly, buyer activity is rising, the values are getting higher. So there's a lot more scrutiny that buyers have to put into how to contract and secure carbon credit portfolios. A few trends to point out. We see an increase in both voluntary and compliance frameworks. So many enterprises and buyers are starting to secure supply to meet their targets. We see a quite remarkable resilience in the market currently when it comes to retirement values. So we also see this on an individual level. So the average contract values of companies continues to rise, which obviously puts a lot more pressure on setting up agreements that withstand the financial risk that comes with those agreements. We also see more complex structures. So long-term offtakes are starting to become much more common in the market as enterprises are trying to secure supply over multiple years, which comes with obviously future pricing risks, but also more long-term delivery risks that need to be reflected. And finally, we're, I think, witnessing a bit of a shift to more dynamic procurement. So many buyers are starting to extend how they procure, extend the number of suppliers that are in the procurement list, which obviously comes with a lot of requirements to make contracting more standardized, leaner, and kind of work a bit against the fact that contracting by now can really often take the bulk of the time that it takes to close a carbon portfolio or a carbon deal. So lots of reasons to put a spotlight on it. I'm very happy to have Peter Mayer and Johannes Ruppel here. So brief intro. Peter is, as Kim said, a partner at Dillenbeck Finley Mayer. He has over 20 years of big law experience, most notably at his own firm right now, where he's one of the leading voices in CDR agreements in both the US and probably worldwide. Previously, he has years of experience as a partner at Stanton's, where he headed the German energy practice and then also worked in New York afterwards. Welcome, Peter. Then I also welcome Johannes Ruppel. Johannes is VP and Legal Counsel at CEEZER. He brings extensive experience in commercial, financial, and regulatory law. He started his career at the US law firm Paul Hastings, then spent a bulk of his career working on new asset types and in new technology law, including crypto and new financial players. At CEEZER, Johannes is responsible for setting market standards on the platform, but also supporting clients across the globe in coming up with practical and yet safe and sound contracts around carbon credits. Welcome, Johannes.
Thank you.
To kick it off, Peter, maybe let's start with the basics. What exactly do you buy when you buy a carbon credit, and why is it important to think about that?
Right. So it's not just a theoretical question. It has really practical implications. You know, what is this thing that you're buying? And how is it being transferred? What rights can be attached to it? Can it be used as a collateral? And if so, under what conditions? So we have, unfortunately, we have sort of a jurisdictional, patchwork situation as to what a carbon credit is. It's being decided on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. There are, in the US, we have sort of the understanding that it is an intangible asset that can be transferred, that is tradable. In Germany, we might want to look at it as a bundle of contractual rights among various parties that are involved in creating this carbon credit. In other jurisdiction, it may be seen as a digital asset, or maybe an asset class of its own. The reason why this is important is one of the key questions is when does title transfer from the supplier to the buyer? What steps need to be taken to achieve that? And so we need to be aware that we can all sort of cover this and be comfortable on these questions by having proper contractual clauses under the relevant law that govern this agreement. We just also need to be aware that once a credit is registered in someone's account at the carbon registry, that does not necessarily mean that the account holder is the owner of those carbon credits. And then the next question becomes, what if a supplier wants to use a carbon credit as collateral for a loan facility? Is this, how can this be achieved? How do we perfect this? So all things sort of that can be done and can be dealt with. So you just need to know and understand sort of jurisdictional differences. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about efforts to unify that, because obviously there's almost always a cross-border element to the creation and trading of verified carbon credits. Yeah, but it is an important question. It's not just sort of a legal academic question, what is a carbon credit? It really has practical implications.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's not necessarily easy to answer. That said, I think maybe looking a bit more at the contracts, right? Like independently, maybe from how exactly you define it, as you said, there's a lot of things that you can do as two parties agreeing on a purchase. So what would you say are typically key components in a contract? You maybe just mentioned a few already. When is a contract bankable? Does it have to be? What are like the key things to watch out for very practically when you approach this topic?
Right. So going back to the baseline, a offtake agreement, carbon credit purchase agreement, forward agreement, pre-purchase agreement, they're all basically it's their purchase agreement, right? So the main elements of the purchase agreement is who are the parties, what is this thing that is being purchased, carbon credit, what are the payment terms, right? So, and then it becomes, so when you get to the payment terms, then it can already become a little bit tricky, right? What is the right price? Not every carbon credit is, the same, there are distinctions. Even, not every biochar credit is the same as any other biochar credit, let alone different pathways. So what is the right price? Then you got to think about what's the delivery term, how might prices change over time? Do I want to have price adjustment clauses in the agreement to reflect that? Maybe as a buyer, I'm now purchasing credits, but I realize in 3-4 years' time that the prices have come down, and I would like to have this adjusted. Same, it can goes both ways from the supplier side as well. That ties into the question of bankability, right? So if a supplier wants this contract to be bankable, the two main elements are, first of all, a contract is sort of never a vacuum in itself, right? The market conditions, is there a market for carbon credits? That is things that a lender would always look at first. Is this an industry that, justifies my involvement? But once that decision has been taken, then they would look at, and a lender would typically look at, okay, what is the price over time? Has this been locked in? And what are the termination rights of the buyer? How easy is it for the buyer to terminate this agreement? And sort of the more secure or the more certain these questions can be answered from a lender's perspective, that adds to the bankability of the agreement. Now, from a supplier's perspective, one thing in case you're any suppliers also on this call, I've also seen the situation where you think, okay, now we got a great offtake agreement with Microsoft or Frontier. That does not necessarily mean that the agreement now becomes automatically bankable for exactly that reason, right? So Frontier, they have the most favored nation clause in their agreement. Maybe some lenders don't like that. So there are things really to be, to be considered and to be taken account, sort of what are the strategic long-term implications of this agreement when I enter into it.
And I think you're touching on an important point there, which is that obviously suppliers and buyers, need to find a good middle, and the interests are obviously not always the same, right? I think you look for price stability or maybe the option to get cheaper as a buyer. As a supplier, obviously want really secure offtake and really secure pricing. So considering all these complexities, especially maybe for buyers and sellers that are kind of newer to the field, um, are there any standard frameworks that you look at frequently? You just mentioned also Frontier and Microsoft, who obviously like have a large volume and also their own terms. Anything that people can use as a form of reference that's available?
Right. So, I mean, I love this space. We're all into this space because we want to support it and we need to scale it. And agreements can really play a very huge part in this, especially sort of standardized agreements. For buyers that are new in this space, the ones that are sort of teetering on the fence and say, should I buy credits in the voluntary carbon market or not? It is extremely helpful for anyone who enters a new market to know that there are legal frameworks out there and contracts that have been approved that are widely acknowledged. And we do not have that at the moment quite yet. And that is a challenge. But there are sort of various initiatives out there that are trying to sort of remedy that situation. There is the Frontier contract is sort of, it's a contract by one company that is a big player in the space, but doesn't necessarily, apply as a standard for the entire industry. In the United States, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they are working on an offtake agreement template. I'm part of sort of the advisory committee to that effort. That template will probably be released sometime early next year. This could be a good indicator. What is already out there are the IETA framework agreements. I find them quite helpful sort of as a starting point. And I think they are, widely used in the industry. They also need to be developed further. I think they're now also a couple of years old when they were first published. We also sort of, our firm is working with a few stakeholders to develop a buyer-friendly version and a supplier-friendly version. So there are, initiatives out there that try to overcome this challenge. I'm working also on occasionally I also do venture capital just to sort of as a contrast to that space, right? In the VC world, when our firm does venture rounds for startup companies, there's absolutely no mystery to these contracts anymore, right? When you do a seed round for a Delaware corporation, everyone knows how this documentation is going to look like, even without sort of having seen the ones for this particular deal, because they're so standardized that you know exactly what's going to be in there. There are 3, 4, 5 things you got to discuss and sort of adjust for the particular transaction. But that helps obviously to scale this tremendously, right? You can finish documents within a time frame of 2, 3, 4 weeks. Is a huge difference to, oh, I've never seen this before. How are we moving forward? And this all takes months and months.
Totally, it makes a lot of sense, right? And I think, particularly, I think you just touched a bit upon the question of like the more long-term offtakes. I think it's already kind of complicated for if you look at the AITA terms, right? They were probably also designed maybe more for the traditional spot deals, right? Anything in particular that you would call out when buyers are approaching, I want to secure a supply over like 3, 4 years? What are like things to really look at early on to make sure that runs?
Right. I mean, sort of before you get into the contract, right, you really have to pay attention to your due diligence, sort of about the project. That is sort of your first risk mitigation tool, due diligence. You got to look at the jurisdiction, at the kind of pathway. biochar is sort of relatively manageable tool now, right? Whereas nature-based, trees only grow that fast. You can't really foretell how the weather's going to be, right? So these are things obviously you need to keep in mind. So I would pay attention to the due diligence, geography. Who are the people I'm dealing with? Have they done these kinds of projects before? What's the regulatory framework in the jurisdiction where this project is taking place? Because you can obviously mitigate risks in an agreement, right? You can have delivery schedules. You can say by X deadline, you need to deliver us X amount of credits. And then there are reps and warranties attached to that and certain remedies when there's a delivery shortfall. But we also, as a buyer, need to understand that the remedies in a contract may be of limited value in the real world. When you're dealing with a 10-people startup company, you have to find ways to get comfortable on a different, not on a different, but on an additional level than just the contract.
Thank you for that. Maybe building a bit on this, right? I think we just talked a bit about like the general frameworks that are available, all these special things that you need to look at. So obviously not easy. I think many buyers are not lawyers, so quite practically they need to at some point approach their legal teams and start looping them in. Let's maybe look a bit practically, Johannes. I mean, you do this and you support a lot of buyers in this as well. Like how can buyers and people in enterprises that buy carbon credits that maybe have more topic knowledge effectively get legal involved? What's a good way to make sure that this runs smoothly? What's a good point to involve the team, and what can you offer to help? Is it the standard terms? Is it other things?
Yeah, so I think you already noted it. Legal will need some preparation and time. So please involve legal as early as you can. Being an in-house lawyer myself, so the desk is full. And as Peter already pointed out, there is not just one commodity framework which is established in the market. So they must be prepared for a new set of contracts, a new asset type. So they will need to do their research and yeah, so that's the one point. And what makes life more difficult here is that your purchasing terms, your general purchasing terms, I would not suggest using them because, yeah, so they are rather drafted for just-in-time delivery of physical goods. And we are dealing here with a totally different asset class. Like when you focus on your purchasing terms, they have the focus. You buy something which is manufactured, and this needs to work for the purpose, and it needs to be there on time. So the focus there is rather when the good is not there, you have severe penalties and so on. And on the other hand, the warranties, because it needs to cover so many asset classes, they are very broad and not specific. So when it comes to carbon credits, there's a little difference. Like the seller doesn't owe you usually delivery of a good. You can have transfer as a mechanism when you have a registry account, but we experienced that most buyers really want a retirement certificate. So the asset you get is a certificate which sets out that 1 ton of carbon dioxide was removed in your favor permanently. And so this is the confirmation by the registry that the underlying ton was actually removed or retired. So I think the delivery mode requires clarification. And also, as Peter pointed out, transfer of title in some jurisdictions might also be a topic and might be worth mentioning in a contract if you determine this is necessary. And the other point is also, so the warranty regime, the question, when is a carbon credit defective? So we don't even have a legal established framework, and there's also no real legislation or jurisdiction on that point. This means I would really advocate for both parties to really determine what is actually owed. So I would say it's better to have a specific set of warranties which are tailored to that asset, because courts can decide in many ways if they even have the time to understand the product. So to mitigate that risk, I think it's good to consider using a specific contract. Also, one point to note, your purchasing terms, just because Peter just said it, they also usually have cancellation rights. So you can step back from a contract whenever you want and so on. This is also something when dealing with, is in particular young companies, they need your contract, your delivery commitment to get financing, to grow further on their mission. So I think it's also something, if you don't offer prepayment, which is a different thing and which can leverage your contractual position, if you don't want to do that, if you want to pay upon delivery, I think it's also good to waive those cancellation rights, unless for sure there's a severe violation of contract or non-delivery or something like that. My 2 points, my 2 main points are: give your legal department time to prepare for that asset class, and maybe think about at least looking at the frameworks which are available, and look at the contract which is provided by your supplier, maybe. And the third thing is, usually you will not buy only one type of credits from one project, so you also need to prepare to negotiate individual supplier agreements, because unless you buy a lot of credits, and I mean investing really lots of money, the supplier will not have the capacity to review and draft your contract. So that's also a consideration on which basis you could start using a platform which has a standardized set of contracts, which has been accepted by each supplier. So you can build your portfolio on the basis of one set of terms. But that's, I think, your decision to be determined with legal. Just take your time.
That makes a lot of sense, but also probably something that most legal teams don't like to hear, right? Take time, and we don't accept the standard terms. So what I like effective strategies, I think you already pointed that out a bit. Like there are standard terms available, which might make it easier. But what is like an approach to simplify those contracts? What are things that you typically see in them? Maybe you can expand a bit on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think some of the provisions, in particular the ones which govern delivery modes, and so you even have provisions on packaging waste and so on. You can get rid of many of these standard delivery of goods provisions. And I think building a robust and short legal framework is key here. I know German law, being a German lawyer, is very helpful there, because you have a statutory framework on which you can build really short form contracts, but also like focus on the key points. And I think I would say, I think I have 3 points noted down before the meeting. So it's like define the credits based on specific data points. So it must be really clear, okay, what am I actually buying? Then I think clear delivery date is key. So suppliers tend to, in particular for forward agreements, we see in the market a tendency of suppliers, sometimes they try to give you something like an option. So if they deliver, it's cool and they get the money, but if they don't deliver, then it has literally no consequences. And this is something I think it's not going to help the market mature on the one hand, and it's also on the other hand bad for a buyer who wants to plan a bit ahead. So I think clear delivery date is crucial, plus maybe some flexibility, because we need to consider there's a registry involved, there's a validation involved, and registries, they are performing a diligent and important review process, which can take time. And I think it's also important for the market and also for you as a buyer that the registry do their work diligently and don't just uh, put their stamp on the credit and issue the credit. So if there is a delay which is caused by the registry, usually it's a good thing because they are doing their work, but it needs to be considered. I would not be too strict on contractual penalties in case of non-delivery, but rather focus on if you need the so on for example replacements. If you need the credits on time, or if you need credits on time, then I think the right approach would rather be not to try to get money from a little supplier, but to really focus on replacements which are available, because usually there are different. So the credit market is huge, and there will be usually options available. So yeah, and the last important point, I already touched it a bit. We need carbon credit specific warranties. So the broad terms included in your purchasing conditions, I would assume they will not help you too much in court, because there is the purpose of your purchase is something not as clear as the inclusion of a little part which is included in your car on your manufacturing line. So yeah, I think that's my main point.
Right. Maybe Peter, how about the US? Do you see it a bit differently? Johannes just revered on the German German law. Well, how does it look like in the US? What do you typically see? What are things that you think should be in there?
Right. I mean, you have the same kind of questions and topics sort of in all jurisdictions. The way you approach them and you solve them, sort of they may be a little, different and be a little bit distinct. Now in the US, obviously, there's no civil code that would help us, and all we have in the voluntary carbon market are contracts. It's all contract law. And sort of that requires sort of a bit of detail, not just a bit, so depending on the size of the transaction and depending on the term and the delivery timeline, a bit more extensive thinking as to what's the right approach. So if you have typically you have a delivery schedule that says by X amount, but by X date you have to deliver X amount of credits. And then what are the remedies if that doesn't happen? There are different ways to deal with this in a contract, right? You could just say, as a buyer, I have a termination, right? I just walk away. Or that would be the harshest solution, right? Or you can deal with grace periods. You can give the supplier the opportunity to source replacement credits from comparable projects in the market. That may be difficult in some pathways, right? So, for instance, in the Microsoft agreement, I saw you have to source replacement credits, and it was an ERW pathway. So good luck with that. That's going to be tricky. So you also need to understand a little bit how the market works to have the right remedy provisions in the agreement. You can distinguish among whose fault is it that there is a shortfall, right? Maybe the supplier acted negligent in any way. Then you as a buyer may be more justified to also ask for monetary compensation if that's worth anything at the end of the day. Or the shortfall may have occurred because of a circumstance entirely out of the control of the supplier. It could be some delays with the registry. The registries typically, obviously, they play a very important role in this entire process, but they are not involved. They're not a party to the agreement. That offers challenges for both buyers and suppliers because they rely very much on what the registry does. And if the registry, approves the credits, certifies them, issues them. So there's a lot of reliance that's being put on the registry, but they disclaim all kinds of liability in this context. So you have to find the right balance between buyer and supplier. Typically there are reps and warranties such as that the supplier needs to provide a representation that all the information they provided to the registry to assess the project and the credits have been complete and accurate and truthful. And that's obviously, these are the kinds of things you got to see sort of what are the elements, what are the things that the two of us, buyer and seller, can agree on to give each other comfort, knowing that we will not have any recourse on the registry. So there may be a fault with a third party, the registry, and that also needs to be taken into account in the remedy provision. Another aspect that is challenging sometimes is the cross-border element to all of this. Right? You have a project in, you have a project in India, and you have a buyer in the US, and the registry sits in Switzerland. There are all kinds of things that could happen, and if you want to account for them properly, you need to do so in the contract. For instance, what happens if the supplier in India becomes insolvent? What happens with those credits? Does the receiver in India maybe has the right to terminate the contract, cancel even the credits maybe? So there are all kinds of, there are all kinds of things one might want to think about when you write an agreement. And since there is no universal legal framework you can fall back on, it is important to think about it when you draft an agreement.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for that. And I think one important point that you touched upon is you need a lot of market knowledge almost, right, to really make sure that this is fit for purpose. And you just spoke a bit about also, if there's not enough supply, a replacement credit might not actually work for you. So it doesn't really matter if you have it in the contract, if it's impossible to find the right supply there. Thinking practically, I think maybe starting with Johannes and then Peter, what do you typically see buyers accept, if they're a bit more experienced, right? I think a lot of the things you just mentioned, Peter, obviously probably make some buyers afraid, right? It's not the kind of risk that you like to take. I think particularly purchasing as an enterprise, you want this to be delivered. You don't want, and you also maybe don't want to just not get a credit, right? Even walking away cannot be great for you because you might have a climate target. So there's a risk to this. So what do you see more experienced buyers accept? What's the practical solution that you frequently see, Johannes?
Well, first of all, one point I would like to make is there are points sitting outside of the contract which really have a large effect on your need for contractual protection. And this is something I would say experienced buyers really know. So when one-time or first-time buyers, they think, okay, we need to just get carbon credits and want to do something which we can report on. But experienced buyers know that it's really important in carbon markets to focus on quality and also build a portfolio of carbon credits. The point I want to make is it's better to buy a good portfolio with a bad contract rather than the other way around. So the best contract, as also Peter pointed out, will not solely help you. And the next point is, once the selection is made, there are also points where you can, commercial points beyond the contract, where you can also navigate the risk a bit, because the delivery risk is something to consider. And speaking of prepayments, which some suppliers want, prepayments can get you way better prices, but they will also increase your exposure and your need for contractual protection. So because if the projects fail, as Peter said, you don't know if you will actually get anything, the credits, because they are developing countries. It's like a these transactions always or usually touch several jurisdictions. And on the other hand, we see very stable suppliers. It's also an important point to make. We see very stable suppliers with a solid balance sheet, strong track record, where buyers are absolutely fine to provide prepayments. But this is just a point to consider beyond the contract. And so then when it comes to the contract, I think experienced buyers, they want fixed delivery dates, and they want to have contractual consequences when delivery does not occur. I think one is flexible on grace periods, but there is this registry risk, but it's also the job of the seller to take these risks into account and to commit on a certain timeline. And so once you need the commitment. And the next point is also, as an experienced buyer, I would love to see some reporting. So some data, which is either when I'm a big buyer delivered directly, or which can be facilitated via a platform like CEEZER, where you can get the information provided to you. But I don't want to take all the points. Maybe Peter, you want to add something as well?
No, I mean, that's all very true. And while it is, I mean, it's not just all risks out there, right? Or you got to at least you got to be aware of the challenges and look for these solutions, because a lot of this can be solved with the right approach. We spoke about due diligence. That is obviously important. You can get a lot of comfort there if you dealing with a supplier that has delivered in the past, that has a track record. You can diversify your portfolio as a buyer if you would like to be certain that you get a certain amount of credits by a particular date. You can sign various offtake agreements and diversify your risk a little bit that way. So there are ways to mitigate that. Contracts are helpful. Obviously, they're a very important tool in this. But sort of sound commercial judgment is probably more important.
Yeah, and also one decision to be made, I think, is when you want to buy a credit like a commodity, delivery very fixed, and maybe in the near future there are credits which have already been issued. They are already sitting in an account, and they can be transferred or retired. While future credits, they do have the certification risk, and so the highest level of security, I think, you get with already issued credits.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to shift focus a bit. So one question I think many of us frequently get is, what's the regulatory angle to things? Like, do I need to take care of something? Are there any requirements for purchase agreement? Is there anything that comes from a regulatory perspective? Maybe we have both sides of the Atlantic here. So again, I think maybe we look at both. Johannes, what's your view?
Yeah. So I think for our business model, but for I think all parties building this market and helping this market mature, it's really important that carbon credits, voluntary carbon credits, are globally not considered financial instruments, and they are not subject to financial regulation. So we also experience that buyers in the markets, they are purchasing carbon credits for their own balance and not for speculative or investment purposes. And so carbon markets are really important to tackle climate change. And we really appreciate also that support on a political level and from a regulator side, who don't over-engineer or build restrictive frameworks in this respect. And I think it's still important not to over-regulate the market to help it grow. And the next point, which also increases reliability, is, but it's an aspect of regulation. It's the communication around carbon credits. there is also already case law in Germany and worldwide available when you want to do advertising on when you want to make net zero claims and carbon neutral products. So transparency is key, and we have always encouraged our customers to be as detailed and as transparent as you can when it comes to the question how you compensate. Because yeah, the fact that you compensate is a good message, but if you mislead, if you're advertising that in a misleading manner, this is something where you can violate applicable laws and should be very, very careful around. And the last point I want to make, so I hope it's when you want to buy carbon credits just for your own procurement, for your own balance, I hope that this is never going to be regulated, and this will not be subject to regulation, while creating financial instruments over carbon credits or building portfolios for speculation. Yes, that's something. Maybe, Peter, not sure what your opinion is there, but that's something where regulators might look into, right?
Right. I mean, in the US, there's no regulatory framework for verified carbon credits, right? Carbon credits are considered to be commodities. And as such, they are being looked at by the Commodity Future and Trading Commission in the US. This is sort of a regulatory body that has a general mandate to overlook the commodities market. They're trying to make sure that it is transparent, that there are that there's no fraud committed in the market. There's no particular framework with respect to VCCs. There have been instances where the CFTC, the Commodities Futures and Trading Commission, has initiated lawsuits against participants in the voluntary carbon market when those were circumstances where they sold credits that didn't exist, for instance. Right? This is something where these are extreme cases. There are regulatory frameworks for registered exchanges where future credits are being traded. Right, so the commodity exchanges, they are subject to regulation, and there are certain guidelines that the CFTC issued just about a year ago. But those are regulations that apply to the exchanges where those future credits are being traded. They don't apply to a buyer purchasing verified carbon credits from a supplier. So on the regulatory side, I don't see anything happening there in the near future or anyway.
So it remains exciting, but it also remains in the hand of buyer and seller to agree to good terms and to make sure that the contracts run. Maybe last question, then we're slowly going to shift a bit to Q&A. Thanks for the questions that we already got, and we're gonna answer them shortly. Maybe last point a bit on maybe more of the long-term forward agreements, right? I think this is something that we see more. There's a higher volume of those in the market. They also require more rules, and maybe different provisions. I think we touched on a few aspects, but just maybe in a quick round, what are the challenges, contractually to make them work, but also what are the opportunities that you can use to also leverage legal frameworks to make that powerful?
Well,
Go ahead, Johannes.
Okay. So I think we touched most of the points already, but I would start with really the point that some uncertainty in terms of timing should just be taken into account. So we still really recommend on setting specific delivery dates and not structure this contract just as an option, but to have a clear obligation, because your ESG and procurement team, they invest lots of time on building that portfolio, on getting that contract done, and it should end with a clear commitment of the seller. And if you want to get already some increased security, you could also align already, if the market is there, on specific alternatives. Should this project not work? Should these credits not be issued in time? So align already on alternatives beforehand. I think this is a sensitive approach, which is helpful for both parties. And then payment is already said, like the payment structure should be in line with your risk appetite and position, and reporting on the progress of the project is also, data is important. Like you can use market participants like CEEZER, which will help you navigate also during this whole cycle of that contract. But those are the points I would start with.
Right. I mean, sort of in addition to the aspects that we already mentioned, right, things from a buyer perspective are, as you said, Johannes, reporting, monitoring, sort of clauses that deal with communication. What if we run into an issue? Do we want the public to know about this? So, confidentiality, mitigation of potential reputational risks. Force majeure clauses are sort of standard, but one thing to also think about over such a long period of time in a nascent industry are change in law clauses. Sometimes there may be regulatory changes that you have not envisioned when you signed the agreement. And then certain adjustments may have to be made. Maybe there are additional environmental requirements that need to be fulfilled with respect to a project. For instance, there will be additional costs involved with that. Who bears those costs? So you cannot foresee all instances of regulatory statutory changes, but you can provide in the agreement sort of for a mitigation or a mediation procedure, right? The parties need to talk about it, and they need to come to some kind of a solution. And if they don't, well, then maybe the buyer may terminate the agreement. But these are, I think these are also things that a good contract should consider.
By the way, this is something we really experience also in practice, and maybe not sure, Peter, how you see it, but that buyer and seller are really open for mediative approaches to find solutions, and to so sellers are willing to provide full transparency on what is happening on the one hand, which helps to maintain the trust, but on the other hand, also buyers are flexible because they it's not their production which is failing, so their damage is not too high when the credit is not in time. So on this basis, and also it's a mission-based thing you are doing, and on this basis, I think you will mostly find solutions, right?
That's our experience as well. People are typically sort of open to communicate and appreciate communication. It is very important, really, I think, to have people on both sides that can talk to each other and that understand each other, and that helps enormously, because there may be some there may be a delay or some unforeseen event in any kind of project, and that's not the end of the world. But it becomes a real issue if you try to hide it under the rug. So it's important from a supplier's perspective, to communicate things, and I think it is important from a buyer's perspective to be receptive and look for constructive approaches and solutions.
But on that basis, it will take even longer until we have a clear jurisdiction on carbon credits if we settle everything out of court. But still, this is the favorable approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think
leaving things to sorry, Magnus, but leaving things to the courts, will take years or decades. That's
Absolutely.
no.
I was just gonna say, I think that's fine. And looking a bit at the time, let's shift a bit towards Q&A. I think one question that we got, and I think it's also something that probably is quite practical for everyone. What are kind of resources? Are there standard contracts? I think you named a few. I think IETA, right, from the International Emissions Trading Association. What are things to make it easy? And are there any templates to look at? Johannes, maybe you want to start.
So yeah, I think Peter already mentioned it. IETA is a good starting point still, because this, although it's maybe some years old, on the one hand, this can be a disadvantage. On the other hand, it's really well known in the market, and we really see many supplier contracts, but also buyer contracts, which are still based on that framework. So it's important. Please don't try to reinvent the wheel. There are already enough templates available. I would still advertise IETA until the initiative which Peter is working on will publish their template, because this is something I'm also really excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're new to the market, as a supplier, and you're looking for a template and you're thinking, how does this look like? Start with the IETA agreement. They have basically two versions. One for primary sales, which would be applicable for you as a supplier. One for secondary sales, which are sort of not that relevant when you are a supplier, but that gives you a good flavor.
Great. And then kind of other question, maybe touching a bit more on what we just talked a bit about the long-term agreements, right? And how pricing works. So when you sign future credits or long-term agreement, how do you manage the pricing for vintages, especially if prices differ by year? What can you typically do?
Well, I think for us this sits a bit outside of the contractual framework. This is a point where I'm not too much involved usually, because it's finding the price, defining the price. But as said before, I think it's good to fix the prices already. It's better for both parties, because both parties do a certain commitment. They can have disadvantages around that commitment, but for a balanced approach, I think it's good that both parties accept the risk that the prices may make a development which they have not foreseen. In particular for suppliers, it's important for their planning that they have a clear price commitment, which helps them maybe also survive decreases in prices which may happen over time.
Peter, any further things that you've seen in the market around price adjustment?
It's right. Primarily it is obviously a commercial point where the parties need to agree on, and then it's going to be reflected in the agreement. But I've seen price adjustment clauses in agreements. I've also seen that very often they are becoming an issue at some point. Either they haven't been drafted properly, and then there is confusion. So that leads to never do this on your own. Right? You gotta get a lawyer involved that helps you with the drafting. Because I've had people come to me and look at this. Now we have this situation, and then I said, yeah, well, tricky. So you gotta, right? So when price adjustment clauses can open up really Pandora's box for both sides. That's why I sort of concur with what Johannes says. Fixed prices are easy, but they sometimes don't reflect sort of where the market is going. So there's a balance, there's a balance to be struck. But just be cautious when you do it. Get proper advice and think it through. And that applies to both sides.
Great, thank you. So one maybe particular question, I think one that is often encountered, how to deal with risks, I think particularly with reversal risk. So what are mechanisms that you can put in place when it comes to, for example, if from a nature-based project, land is destroyed or the forest is destroyed? I mean, the registries have a role to play, of course, but what do you typically see in contracts being contracted? Again, maybe starting Johannes or Peter, maybe you want to go ahead.
Right. So reversals are obviously, especially in a nature-based context, are obviously sort of a big topic. Sort of what you can see in contracts is sometimes that there's a distinction between avoidable reversals and unavoidable reversals, and then they have different kinds of remedies. So an avoidable reversal is something where the supplier has caused it because of negligence, for instance. That's prompted that is the case in a wildfire, but typically wildfires are caused by sort of natural causes, and then you typically, so there are various ways of dealing with this. I would argue for an extension of the delivery period, right? To say, okay, we need to rebuild it. Maybe we get another, for a day-by-day extension of the delivery date until we have sort of recovered that. Maybe a buyer says that takes too long. Plus how are you going to finance that? So then, there's a way, okay, maybe we can secure replacement credits from other projects, especially if the supplier has various projects. That may be an option unless they are already under commitment for different offtake agreement. If nothing works, then the parties will have to terminate the agreement. But a typical approach would be extend the delivery term, look for replacement credits. If nothing works, then the only option that's left is terminating, but without recourse on for each other's side, because that's sort of an act of God, so to speak.
Okay, gotcha. And maybe 1 minute answer, probably for Peter, the NREL contract, the sample contract, what's the expected timing for that? Do you know that? Or
yeah, we expect we expect to be able to publish it early next year.
Great. That's the short answer. We're just in time. We're gonna close here. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Johannes, for sharing your really valuable insights. Thanks for everyone joining the webinar. The recording will also be distributed, so you will have it if you need it. It's great to hear from two attorneys that are really deep in the field. Clearly, carbon credit contracts are increasingly important, and the higher the value, the higher the stake, obviously. And thanks so much. If you have any questions, obviously you can reach out to our team, but also to Peter. We're happy to follow up with you, and thanks all for attending. Bye-bye.